They had been told that America was a land of savagery, a place where greed ruled over everything, and cruelty was the norm for anyone who dared to oppose it. But when the German POWs finally set foot on US soil, what they encountered shattered every illusion they had been fed for years. Imagine being a battle-hardened soldier, not even out of your 20s, who had marched across deserts and through bombed-out cities under a regime that promised eternal glory, but delivered only endless fatigue, scorching sands, and the bitter taste of defeat. The year was 1943, and in the sun-baked expanses of North Africa, Erwin Rommel's once unstoppable Afrika Korps had crumbled like a sandcastle under the relentless assault of Allied tanks, artillery, and airstrikes. German and Italian troops, exhausted and outgunned, surrendered in droves, thousands upon thousands, laying down their rifles and helmets, their hands raised in weary resignation. For these men, the war appeared to be over, but the shadow of what lay ahead loomed larger than any battlefield they had faced, filling their hearts with a gnawing dread that no bullet could match, captivity at the mercy of the Americans. Nazi propaganda had been relentless in its portrayal of the United States as a monstrous empire, a decadent society built on exploitation where prisoners would be treated worse than animals. Posters plastered across barracks walls depicted Americans as heartless capitalists. Speeches from high-ranking officers echoed warnings of torture and starvation, and late-night whispers among comrades painted vivid pictures of brutal internment camps hidden in remote wastelands. To soldiers already worn thin by the chaos of war, the constant roar of engines, the sting of sand in their eyes, the hollow ache of hunger from dwindling supplies. The idea of being shipped off to such a fate was terrifying. It clawed at their minds more fiercely than the meager rations of stale bread, watery soup, and occasional scraps of canned meat they received in the makeshift holding pens after their capture. The air in those temporary camps was thick with dust and despair. Men huddled in groups, sharing cigarettes if they had any left, trying to steel themselves for the unknown. When the commands finally came, barked out by Allied guards and clipped accents, the prisoners were rounded up like cattle, loaded onto dusty trucks that rattled over uneven terrain toward the bustling ports along the Mediterranean coast. There, massive Liberty ships loomed in the harbors, their hulking forms a testament to American industrial might. Vessels churned out in record time from shipyards across the ocean, originally meant for hauling war material, but now repurposed as floating prisons. The Germans were herded aboard, descending into the dim, cramped holds below decks, where the air grew stale and heavy almost immediately. Hundreds of men were crammed into spaces meant for cargo, their personal belongings confiscated, leaving them with little more than the uniforms on their backs and the weight of uncertainty pressing down on their chests. Guards stationed above kept watch with rifles at the ready, their faces stern but not overtly hostile, as the ship's engines rumbled to life and the vessels pulled away from the shore, heading into the vast, unforgiving Atlantic. Hans, a young infantryman from the rolling hills of Bavaria, who had joined the Wehrmacht with dreams of adventure but found only the grim reality of combat, later confided in a smuggled note to his sister that the departure felt like sailing straight into oblivion. "We were convinced we were bound for some infernal place," he wrote, his handwriting shaky from the ship's constant motion. "Every soldier around me harbored the same silent terror. Would we be chained in mines, forced to labor until our bones broke, or simply forgotten in a frozen wilderness?" Such accounts, pieced together from diaries and post-war recollections, paint a vivid picture of the atmosphere aboard those ships. A tense quietude punctuated by the occasional groan of seasick men, the creak of metals straining against waves, and the low hum of conversations where soldiers tried to distract themselves from the dread coiling in their guts. Few among them had ever ventured beyond Europe's borders. America was a distant enigma, glimpsed only in grainy propaganda reels showing towering skyscrapers belching smoke and streets filled with scheming opportunists. To these men, it was less a country and more a myth, an enormous shadowy realm separated by an ocean that seemed endless. The crossing itself was fraught with peril, a gauntlet that tested the resolve of captors and captives alike. German U-boats, those stealthy predators of the deep, still lurked beneath the waves, their torpedoes a constant threat to the Allied convoys snaking across the Atlantic. The prisoners confined to the lower decks could feel the ship's evasive maneuvers, the sudden zigzags that sent men stumbling into one another, hammocks swaying wildly like pendulums in a storm. Whispers rippled through the holds. What if one of our own submarines struck us down? Would the fatherland's navy hesitate, knowing countrymen were aboard, or would they fire anyway in the name of duty? Nights were the worst, when darkness enveloped everything, and the only sounds were the relentless thrum of the engines and the slap of waves against the hull. Sleep came in fitful bursts, dreams haunted by visions of exploding ships and icy waters pulling them under. Every unusual noise, a distant boom, a sharp turn, sent hearts racing, men clutching at their thin blankets as if they could ward off disaster. Yet, amid this pervasive anxiety, glimmers of unexpected decency began to pierce the gloom, challenging the deeply ingrained fears sown by years of indoctrination. Meals, though basic and served in metal trays passed down from above, were surprisingly substantial. Portions of stew, bread, and even occasional fruit that far surpassed the meager fare from their final days in Africa, where rations had been cut to near starvation levels, amid supply line collapses. The guards enforced order with firmness, but there was no gratuitous violence, no random beatings to assert dominance. Cigarettes, those small luxuries that could calm frayed nerves, were distributed sporadically, tossed into the holds with casual indifference that bordered on generosity. Karl, a stoic mechanic from Hamburg who had repaired tanks under fire and now shared a hammock space with Hans, recalled one such moment in a post-war interview. I asked a guard through the hatch why they bothered feeding us properly. He looked down, shrugged his shoulders, and said in halting German, "Your men, not beasts. Eat and shut up." Those words stuck with me, he added, because they didn't match the monster I had been warned about. They carried a rough humanity that made me question everything. Such interactions, brief and unscripted, started to erode the monolithic image of the enemy that had been drilled into these soldiers since basic training. The Americans above deck went about their duties with an efficiency that spoke of discipline, but there was an undercurrent of normalcy. Sailors humming tunes from home, sharing jokes during watch changes, or wiping sweat from their brows as they maintained the ship. Prisoners catching glimpses through ventilation grates saw young men much like themselves, faces etched with the weariness of war, but not twisted by hatred. For Hans, these observations became a quiet obsession. He would press his ear to the bulkhead, listening to snippets of conversation in English, piecing together words he half understood from school lessons long ago. It was as if the ocean voyage was not just a physical journey, but a mental one, slowly dismantling the barriers of propaganda, one small revelation at a time. As the days stretched into weeks, the monotony of the sea began to wear on everyone, turning the holds into pressure cookers of boredom and tension. Men devised ways to pass the time, card games with makeshift decks fashioned from torn paper, storytelling sessions where comrades recounted battles from Poland to El Alamein, or quiet songs sung in low voices to evoke memories of beer halls and family gatherings. Seasickness claimed many, the rolling waves turning strong stomachs inside out, buckets overflowing and adding to the fetid atmosphere that clung to skin and clothing like a second layer. Ventilation fans whirred ineffectively, the air growing thick with the sense of unwashed bodies, vomit, and the ever-present tang of salt water. That Hans, who had never been on a boat larger than a river ferry, found himself battling waves of nausea, leaning against Karl for support during the worst storms, when the ship pitched violently, sending loose items skittering across the deck floors. Storms were frequent visitors on the Atlantic Road, transforming the journey into a test of endurance that blurred the lines between prisoner and guard. Massive waves crashed over the bows, the ship groaning under the assault, as if protesting the burden it carried. Below, men were thrown from their hammocks, bruises blooming on arms and legs from impacts with metal walls or fellow prisoners. The guards, equally battered, would shout down assurances that the vessel was sound, their voices strained but steady. In one particularly fierce gale, as recounted by several survivors, water seeped through hatches, soaking blankets and heightening fears of sinking. Yet in the aftermath, when the skies cleared and the sea calmed, guards lowered extra rations, warm soup and dry bread to help restore strength. It was a practical gesture, born of necessity to keep the prisoners healthy, but to the Germans it felt like an olive branch, a sign that their lives held value even in enemy hands. Karl, ever the pragmatist, began to voice his observations more openly as the voyage progressed. Sitting cross-legged on the floor during a rare moment of calm, he turned to Hans and said, "If this is how they treat us at sea, where escape is impossible and resources are limited, what awaits us on land? Could it be that the stories we heard were exaggerated to keep us fighting?" Hans nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. The food, the lack of abuse, the occasional cigarettes, these were not the actions of a cruel oppressor, but of a system that valued order over vengeance. Rumors still circulated, of course. tales of prisoners being sent to Siberian-like tundras in Alaska or paraded naked through jeering crowds in New York. But they held less sway now, drowned out by the tangible evidence of fair treatment. Men who had arrived aboard trembling with fear now shared tentative smiles, their conversations shifting from dread to speculation about what America might truly hold. By the midpoint of the crossing, a fragile routine had emerged in the holds, mirroring the structured life of military barracks, but softened by the absence of combat. Morning brought a head count through the hatches, guards calling out numbers in accented German, followed by meal distribution that marked the day's rhythm. Afternoons were for rest or quiet activities, evenings for reflection as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through any available portholes. Some prisoners took to teaching each other skills, basic English phrases for Hans, mechanical tips from Karl, preparing for an uncertain future. The irony wasn't lost on them. Here they were, enemies of the state that held them, yet learning its language as if planning to integrate rather than resist. It was during these sessions that deeper doubts surfaced. Men admitting in hushed tones that perhaps the Führer's vision of a weak, divided America was flawed, that a nation capable of building fleets of ships and sustaining convoys across oceans couldn't be as decadent as claimed. As landfall approached, the atmosphere aboard shifted once more, a mix of anticipation and renewed anxiety rippling through the ranks. The air grew fresher, carrying hints of earth and industry rather than just salt and diesel. Men crowded near vents and hatches, straining for the first whiff of the new world. Spotters above deck called out sightings of distant shores, and the prisoners' murmurs grew louder. What would they find? Barbed wire hellscapes or something altogether different? Hans pressed his face to a small grill, his heart pounding as the outline of the coastline materialized, dotted with cranes, smokestacks, and the faint hum of activity. The Liberty ships eased into harbors bustling with life, horns blaring in welcome or warning, and for the first time the Germans glimpsed the reality of their destination. But as the hatches finally swung open and sunlight poured in, blinding after weeks in dimness, the true test of their expectations was about to begin, revealing a land that would upend everything they thought they knew. The moment the prisoners emerged from the shadowy confines of the holds, blinking against the harsh sunlight that flooded the decks, the air hit them like a revelation. Crisp, laced with the sense of tar from the docks, smoke from distant factories, and an undercurrent of something unexpectedly inviting, like the aroma of fresh-baked bread wafting from nearby warehouses. This was no desolate prison landing. It was New York Harbor, or Boston, or Norfolk, pulsing with the energy of a nation at war, yet somehow untouched by its ravages. Cranes swung overhead, unloading crates of supplies with mechanical precision, while workers in overalls shouted orders in a cacophony of accents that blended into a symphony of productivity. To the Germans, who had left behind a Europe scarred by aerial bombings and ground assaults, this scene was bewildering, a testament to resilience and resources that their own homeland could no longer muster. As they were marched down the gangplanks in orderly lines, guards flanking them with rifles at ease rather than aimed, the prisoners' eyes widened at the sheer scale of it all. Towering buildings loomed in the distance, their windows intact and gleaming, roads teemed with vehicles, trucks laden with goods, cars zipping by with drivers who barely glanced at the procession of captives. Hans, stepping onto solid ground for the first time in weeks, felt the firmness under his boots and whispered to Karl beside him, "This place, it's alive, not broken like our cities." Karl, his face etched with caution, nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the stacks of cargo that seemed endless. Boxes of ammunition, food, machinery, all flowing in to fuel the Allied machine. The propaganda had promised a land on the brink of collapse, riddled with internal strife and shortages. But here was evidence of the opposite, a powerhouse churning without pause. The first real shock came not from the infrastructure, but from the immediate treatment they received on the docks. Instead of being shoved into holding pens or subjected to degrading searches, the prisoners were directed to lines where American personnel, cooks in white aprons, medics with clipboards stood ready. Steaming pots bubbled with hearty stew, loaves of bread were sliced and distributed, and mugs of hot coffee were pressed into calloused hands. The aroma alone was intoxicating, a far cry from the thin gruel of the holding camps in Africa. Men who had braced for starvation now found themselves holding trays laden with food that was warm, filling, and abundant. One young soldier from Berlin, his uniform still caked with desert dust, hesitated before taking a bite, his eyes darting suspiciously as if expecting poison. But when he finally tasted the meal, potatoes mashed with butter, chunks of meat and gravy, his shoulders relaxed, and a murmur of astonishment spread through the ranks. Guards oversaw the process with a professional detachment, their voices firm but devoid of malice. "Eat up," they said in English, some translating into basic German for clarity. No rushing, no portioning out scraps based on rank or favor. The distribution was equitable, adhering to the Geneva Convention's mandates that prisoners be fed comparably to the captor's own troops. For Hans, this was a pivotal moment. He turned to Karl, his tray balanced carefully, and said under his breath, "They feed us like this right after arrival? No tricks, no humiliation?" Karl, chewing thoughtfully, replied, "It doesn't match what we were told. Back home we'd be lucky for a crust, and here, this." The cigarettes followed soon after. Packs handed out casually, matches struck to light them. Men inhaled deeply, the tobacco a soothing balm against the disorientation. And for a brief instant, the docks felt less like a gateway to imprisonment and more like an unexpected respite. From the harbors, the journey continued inland. The prisoners herded onto waiting trains that chugged away from the coast with a rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. These were no cattle cars of despair. Boxcars had been modified with benches bolted to the floors, windows left open to allow fresh air and views of the passing landscape. Guards patrolled the aisles, their presence a constant reminder of captivity, but the atmosphere lacked the brutality the Germans had anticipated. No chains bound their wrists, no dogs snapped at their heels. Instead, orders were issued calmly, with an emphasis on compliance rather than fear. As the trains gathered speed, leaving the bustling ports behind, the prisoners settled in, their bodies aching from the sea voyage, but their minds alive with curiosity. Hans pressed his face to the glass, watching as urban sprawl gave way to suburbs with neatly manicured lawns, houses with porches where families sat in the evening light, children waving flags or simply staring in wide-eyed wonder at the foreign men rolling past. The landscapes unfolding outside were a revelation in themselves, endless fields of golden wheat swaying in the breeze, orchards heavy with fruit, rivers winding through verdant valleys without a trace of wartime destruction. In Europe, such scenes had been marred by tank tracks, bomb craters, and the skeletal remains of burned-out villages. Here, everything appeared pristine, as if the war were a distant rumor rather than a global cataclysm. Karl, seated across from Hans, pointed out a herd of cattle grazing peacefully, their numbers vast compared to the emaciated livestock back home. "Look at that," he muttered. "They have enough to feed armies and still more left over." The abundance extended to the towns they passed through. Grocery stores with windows displaying pyramids of canned goods, bakeries emitting the scent of fresh pastries, gas stations where cars lined up without ration coupons. Advertisements plastered on billboards touted Coca-Cola, chewing gum, and ice cream, items that had become mythical luxuries in ration-strapped Germany. Interactions with civilians added layers to the bewilderment. At stops for refueling or water, locals gathered near the tracks, their expressions a mix of curiosity and restraint. Children, bold and unscarred by air raids, ran alongside the trains shouting questions or simply waving. In one small Virginia town, a group of school kids tossed apples through the open windows, the fruit caught eagerly by surprised prisoners. Guards allowed it, chuckling at the scene rather than intervening harshly. Hans caught one such apple, biting into its crisp sweetness, and felt a pang of something unfamiliar, gratitude mixed with confusion. These people, he thought, they see us as the enemy, yet they share their food? Karl, ever analytical, suggested it was propaganda on their part, a show to demoralize us. But even he couldn't deny the genuineness in the children's laughter or the casual waves from farmers leaning on fences. The trains pushed deeper into the heartland, through states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, where factories belched smoke but stood intact. Workers streaming in and out in shifts that spoke of unyielding production. Prisoners glimpsed silos bursting with grain, railroads laden with coal and steel, all feeding the war effort yet leaving plenty for domestic life. Envy crept in for some, bitterness for others. How could a nation so far from the front lines thrive while Germany crumbled under Allied bombs? Conversations in the cars turned philosophical, men debating in low voices whether this prosperity was the result of exploitation or superior organization. Hans, growing bolder, shared his thoughts with a cluster of comrades. If America is weak and greedy as we were taught, why do their roads not have holes, their children not look hungry? The questions hung unanswered, seeds of doubt taking root in minds, long conditioned to unquestioning loyalty. By nightfall on those train rides, as the cars rocked gently and stars wheeled overhead, the prisoners found a strange peace in the motion. Guards dimmed lights, allowing rest, and the absence of sirens or explosions was a luxury in itself. Some dozed fitfully, dreams weaving between memories of home and the surreal sights of the day. Others stayed awake, staring out at moonlit fields, pondering their fate. The destination loomed, prisoner of war camps scattered across the Midwest and South. Names like Camp Atterbury or Fort Knox whispered among the ranks. Would these be the hellish enclosures of legend, or would they mirror the fairness encountered so far? As the train slowed near their stops, the prisoners braced once more, the clang of couplings signaling the end of this leg and the beginning of true internment. But what awaited behind the gates would prove even more transformative, reshaping not just their daily lives, but their very understanding of the enemy they had fought. Stepping through the barbed wire gates of the camps for the first time, the German prisoners held their breath, muscles tensed for the onslaught of degradation they had been conditioned to expect. Shouts of abuse, stripping searches, or immediate assignment to grueling punishment details. Instead, they were met with a scene that defied their darkest imaginings. Orderly rows of wooden barracks standing in neat grids, gravel paths sweeping between them, and a central flagpole where the stars and stripes fluttered lazily in the breeze. Guard towers dotted the perimeter, their spotlights idle in the daylight, and the air carried the mundane sounds of daily life, clanging pots from a kitchen, distant laughter from a recreation area, even the faint thump of a ball being kicked on a makeshift field. This was no torture compound hidden in isolation. It was a functional enclave, almost village-like, designed to house thousands with efficiency and, astonishingly, a measure of humanity. The intake process unfolded with military precision, but without the venom the prisoners anticipated. They were lined up for registration, names and serial numbers recorded by clerks who spoke in neutral tones, fingerprints taken, and basic medical checks performed to ensure no diseases from the voyage lingered. Uniforms were issued, simple khaki outfits marked with PW in bold letters, and personal items like watches or photos returned after inspection. Hans, shuffling forward in the queue, exchanged a glance with Carl, both men silently noting the absence of slaps or insults. "It's like reporting for duty," Hans murmured, but Carl shushed him, still wary of hidden traps. Once processed, they were assigned to barracks, long, low buildings with bunk beds stacked too high, lockers for belongings, and windows that let in natural light. The smell inside was of fresh wood and soap, a far cry from the fetid holds of the ships or the dust-choked tents in Africa. The dining halls provided the next wave of disbelief. Prisoners filed in for their first meal, trays in hand, and were confronted with spreads that rivaled peacetime messes back home. Roast beef, sliced thick, boiled vegetables steaming hot, bread with real butter, and pudding for dessert. Coffee flowed freely, strong and black, a commodity scarce in wartime Germany. Under the Geneva Convention, the U.S. was bound to provide rations equivalent to those of its own soldiers, and they adhered to it meticulously. Men sat at long tables, eating in stunned silence at first, forks clinking as they savored flavors they hadn't tasted in months. One prisoner from Dresden, his eyes wide, leaned over to his neighbor and said, "This can't be standard. Perhaps it's a welcome trick to lower our guard." But as days turned to weeks, the meals remained consistent. 3 times a day, nourishing bodies that had grown lean from battle and travel. For Hans, who had survived on ersatz coffee and turnip soup, each bite was a quiet rebellion against the propaganda that had promised starvation. Daily life in the camps settled into a rhythm that balanced structure with surprising freedoms, designed to combat boredom and maintain morale as much as to enforce control. Mornings began with roll call, prisoners assembling in the yard as guards counted heads with methodical efficiency, the process over in minutes without harassment. Afterward, assignments were given, some to kitchen duty, peeling potatoes or stirring massive vats, others to maintenance, sweeping paths or repairing fences, a few to educational classes where volunteer instructors taught English, history, or even vocational skills like carpentry. The Americans understood that idle hands bred trouble, so they filled the hours purposefully. Soccer fields, marked with chalk on packed dirt, became hubs of activity. Teams forming along regional lines, Bavarians versus Prussians, with matches drawing crowds that cheered and jeered in good-natured rivalry. The sound of boots thudding against leather balls echoed across the wire, a reminder that life persisted even in confinement. Evenings brought further surprises, with recreation halls screening films on makeshift projectors, Hollywood comedies that elicited laughter despite language barriers, newsreels showing Allied advances carefully selected to avoid inciting unrest, and documentaries on American life that subtly challenged Nazi dogma. In some camps, prisoners organized choirs, their voices harmonizing in folk songs from the Rhineland or hymns from Lutheran churches, the melodies carrying over the fences to intrigue nearby farmers. Art supplies were provided: paper, paints, wood scraps, and men who had been artists or craftsmen before the war poured their energies into creations, landscapes of remembered German countrysides, carved figurines of animals, or intricate models of ships. These pieces, often traded with guards for small favors, later became cherished mementos, symbols of creativity flourishing against odds. Karl, with his mechanical background, tinkered with broken tools in the workshops, fixing radios or clocks, his hands finding purpose in the familiar motions. Mail from home, delivered through the Red Cross, was a lifeline that bridged the ocean's divide, though letters arrived sporadically, censored but intact. Prisoners pored over news from families, tales of bombings, food shortages, loved ones lost, contrasting sharply with their own relative comfort. In return, they penned responses with care, describing camp life in veiled terms to avoid disbelief or censorship. "We are well fed and occupied," Hans wrote to his parents. "The work is fair, and the days pass without incident." Such words, when read amid the ruins of Berlin or Munich, must have seemed like fantasies, but they were grounded in truth. The camps fostered a sense of normalcy that dulled the sting of captivity, turning enemies into residents of a temporary world where routine provided stability. Yet tension simmered beneath the surface, a reminder that this was no holiday. Discipline was enforced rigorously. Infractions like arguing with guards or hoarding food led to solitary confinement or reduced privileges. Escape attempts, though infrequent, were met with swift recapture, the vast American countryside offering no hiding places for foreigners, with accents and marked uniforms. Within the barracks, ideological divides festered. Die-hard Nazis formed cliques, enforcing loyalty through intimidation, while others like Hans began questioning the regime's narratives. Whispers turned to arguments. Odo, a fervent believer from the SS ranks, clashed with doubters, insisting that surrender was temporary and victory inevitable. Hans countered one night, his voice steady. "If Germany is so superior, why do we sit here fed by those we called inferior?" The debates raged in shadows, fracturing friendships but also forcing introspection. As the prisoners adapted, the camps became microcosms of transformation, where the initial shock of fairness evolved into deeper reflections on war and humanity. But it was beyond the wires, in the fields and factories of rural America, where their experiences would deepen further, exposing them to the everyday lives of their captors, and planting seeds of change that would bloom long after the gates opened. The farmer's nod was not kindness, but it was not cruelty either. And in that small gesture, Hans felt the ground shift beneath his understanding of what captivity could mean. The day wore on with the rhythm of the harvest, prisoners and guards moving in a strange harmony under the relentless southern heat. The only sounds the rustle of cotton plants, the creak of wagon wheels, and the occasional low command from a guard who seemed more concerned with the crop than with ideology. By noon, a farmer's wife appeared at the edge of the field with a dented tin bucket of water, dipping a ladle and passing it down the line. The Germans drank in silence, the cool liquid cutting through the dust in their throats, and when Hans handed the ladle back, the woman met his eyes for a brief moment before turning away. No smile, no hatred, just the transaction of thirst on a working day. Karl worked a few rows over, his mechanic's hands more accustomed to wrenches than plant stems. But he adapted quickly, his movements precise and efficient. He noticed how the guards relaxed as the hours passed, rifles resting against fence posts, conversations drifting into small talk about weather and yields. One guard, a lanky boy from Iowa, barely older than the prisoners, even asked Karl in halting German if he had ever driven a tractor. Karl shook his head, and the guard laughed, saying, "You will before the week's out." It was not friendship, but it was not enmity either, and in that space between the two, something unexpected began to grow. The realization that the war, for all its grand speeches and sweeping battles, came down to men bending their backs under the same sky, doing the same work for the same harvest. The pay was another shock, though most of the wages were withheld to cover the cost of their upkeep. Each prisoner received scrip, 80 cents a day, redeemable at the camp canteen for soap, razor blades, candy, or cigarettes. To men who had bartered bullets for bread in North Africa, the idea of earning money in captivity was absurd. Hans bought a bar of chocolate on his first payday, unwrapping it slowly in the barracks that night, breaking it into pieces to share with Karl and two others. The sweetness lingered on their tongues like a memory of peacetime, and for a moment the barbed wire outside seemed less like a cage and more like a boundary they had simply not yet crossed. Back in the camp, the evenings filled with the sounds of life resuming its stubborn pulse. Soccer matches under floodlights drew crowds that cheered with the same fervor they might have shown in Munich beer gardens. A prisoner from Saxony, once a violinist in a Leipzig orchestra, tuned a battered instrument borrowed from a guard and played a wistful waltz that drifted across the compound, drawing even the sentries to listen from their towers. Letters arrived, thin envelopes bearing Red Cross stamps, words from mothers and wives scrawled in fading ink, describing bombed-out streets and empty larders. The prisoners read them in silence, then folded them carefully. The contrast between their own full bellies and the hunger at home a weight none dared speak aloud. Yet the contradictions of America began to surface like stones in a plowed field. On a trip to a nearby town for supplies, Hans saw the signs for the first time, whites only above a water fountain, colored scrawled on a restroom door. The prisoners, marched in a column under guard, paused as a black soldier in crisp uniform was waved to a separate line at the mess hall, his tray holding smaller portions than theirs. Karl whispered, "We are the enemy, yet we eat better than their own." The words hung between them, heavy with questions neither could answer. In the barracks that night, the debate flared. Otto, still clinging to the old certainties, sneered that it proved America's hypocrisy, its weakness masked by wealth. Hans countered quietly, "It proves they are human, flawed, like us." The argument ended in silence, but the seed was planted. Work details became routine, the prisoners fanning out across the countryside to pick peaches in Georgia, beets in Colorado, tobacco in Kentucky. Farmers grew accustomed to the sight of PW-marked shirts in their fields, and some began to nod in greeting, even offer a cold drink from a jug on the porch. Children followed the columns, curious and unafraid, sometimes tossing baseballs over the fence for the prisoners to throw back. One afternoon in Kansas, a storm rolled in just as the wheat was ready, and the prisoners worked alongside the farmer and his sons until dusk, racing the rain. When the last sheaf was stacked, the farmer pressed a jar of lemonade into Hans's hands. "Good work," he said, and walked away. Hans drank it on the march back, the tart sweetness mixing with the dust on his lips, and thought, "This is what victory looks like. Not tanks, but shared labor under a shared sky." As the months turned to years, the camp became a world unto itself. A strange limbo where the war continued outside, but life inside followed its own logic. The prisoners learned to navigate the rules, the small freedoms, the quiet rebellions. Some carved wooden toys for local children, slipping them through the fence. Others traded sketches for extra cigarettes. A few, like Karl, began to dream of staying, of applying for emigration when the war ended, drawn by the memory of fields that never went hungry. Hans remained torn, his loyalty to home warring with the evidence of his eyes. But both men carried the same quiet knowledge. The America they had been taught to hate had treated them with a fairness. Their own leaders had never shown their own people. When the news of Germany's surrender finally reached the camp in May 1945, it came not with trumpets but with silence. The guards read the announcement in flat voices, and the prisoners stood in the yard, the spring sun warm on their faces, the weight of the words settling like dust. Some wept, others stared at the ground. Otto cursed under his breath, but even he sounded hollow. Hans felt nothing at first, then a slow unraveling, as if the last thread connecting him to the Reich had snapped. The war was over. The camps would empty. But the lessons of those years, the taste of lemonade, the sound of a violin at dusk, the sight of a black soldier denied the same tray, would follow them across the ocean and into whatever came next. Repatriation was slow, the Liberty ships now carrying men home instead of to captivity. Hans and Karl boarded together, standing at the rail as the American coast receded, the fields and towns shrinking to green and brown patches under a vast sky. Neither spoke of the future. There was no need. They had seen a country that fed its enemies, worked beside its captors, and still stumbled over its own contradictions. They had seen humanity persist where ideology said it should not. And in the quiet between the engine's thrum and the cry of gulls, they carried that truth home, not as prisoners, but as men who had glimpsed something larger than victory or defeat. Years later, Hans would tell his grandson, sitting on a Bavarian porch with the Alps in the distance, "I saw America first as an enemy, and I left it as a witness. Treat a man with dignity, even when he wears the wrong uniform, and you build something stronger than fear. The boy would nod, not fully understanding, but the story would stay with him, passed down like the carved wooden horse Hans still kept on his shelf, a relic of a cotton field in Alabama, a farmer's nod, and a war that ended not with hatred, but with the possibility of something else.